So we're going to begin with a bit of discussion of architecture and medicine of ancient Greece. As we've said before, some of the influence in Egypt had come in the Alexandrian school because the Greeks had conquered that portion of Egypt. The Greeks really worked around the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and primarily their influence was the area that focused on the Aegean Sea. Macedonia is to the north, Asia Minor and what we now think of as Turkey and Ionia is on the east, and many of the greatest finds from an archaeological standpoint are going to find themselves in Turkey. And you can see on the southern side of the Mediterranean Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile. And as time passes by, Greek influence will actually cross over into the Etruscan area, pre-Roman use of what we now know as Italy. So historically the Greeks were involved for many centuries. In the 8th and 9th centuries BC, they were basically city-states. Small areas, we would think of them as towns today because of the size of their population, but they were totally independent. They governed themselves, they had battles with one another, and they were not particularly joined together. By the 7th century, we know that they were using coins, that they had an alphabet, probably that came primarily from the East again. And by the 6th century, we have the transition to what we think of as an important moment, democracy in Athens. And by 300 BC, this is the period of Alexander the Great. This is the period when the Greeks move and conquer a great deal to their east, crossing considerably into the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. So in Greek religion, they believe that the creation of the world was found when there was a battle between the earth gods and the sky gods, and that was the time when earth was created. Gods were considered to be immortal, and they exhibited various human weaknesses. The earth gods were the Titans, term we use today. It's the name of a football team, it's the name of movies and so forth, and a variety of stuff. We continue to use the language of the Greeks. Numerous temples were constructed in dedication to these gods. Here you see the sanctuary of Apollo. This is in famous Delphi in Greece. It's from the 6th to the 3rd century BC, and this is the location where the famous Oracle of Delphi would be found. The priestesses were supposedly predicting the future. What we think we know is that they were chewing laurel leaves and drinking from the spring, and together this created the hallucinogenic effects, and so their various predictions and thoughts were coming from their unconscious or subconscious, and was a very important area for people to learn from. Now, originally, the area was supposedly created with mud brick construction, which was later replaced by stone and marble, as the richness of the temple and the oracle increased as more and more people sought out the advice of the priestesses. Of course, everyone studying architecture knows the Parthenon and the Acropolis at Athens. This is from about 450 BC, and it is one of the most famous buildings in the world. Its proportions are studied continuously. One of the most famous elements of it is the notion of entasis, the fact that the columns and the floor bend slightly in order to counteract the illusion of depth and vision of such a large building. Well, how about Greek literature? We know of the mythology that's been written about by Homer. We still have material on the tragedies of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. The philosophy world really begins, Western philosophy really begins with Socrates, Aristotle, and then Plato. History, we know that Herodotus is one of the beginning authors. He's often called the father of history. And it's through many of these works that we will ultimately get an image of Greek medicine. Now, the theater you see in the photo is Epidaurus, which is one of the famous medical sites. This is Discobolus, famous sculpture by Myron, also known as the discus thrower. Myron was the original sculptor, or believed to be, but this is a Roman copy of the original bronze. It's a depiction of the Olympic sporting by the Greek males, and is part of the notion of the arts and the physical sports and athletic prowess all being part of an ideal of what humanity was about. And at the same time, it illustrates the skill of the artists and artisans in dealing with marble or bronze, and the refinement of the depiction of the human body, the proportions, and the ability to illustrate through art what we think of as a beautiful standard. Well, that level of art came from earlier pieces. Notice the influence, the obvious influence of the Egyptian art. Remember when we described the canon and the proportions and the use of figures, the way figures were depicted in Egypt. So this is known as a kouros. It's an early, almost 600 BC sculpture found in Greece. And here we see another image, Cretan boy found on the Acropolis in Athens somewhere close to 500 BC. Again, the transition from the kouros to a much more natural figure, and ultimately here is Polykleitos, the famous sculptor. This is a spear bearer. Again, this is a Roman copy of the original bronze, but notice how now the proportions, the movement, the sort of live character of the body, completely different from the Egyptian canon. And then finally, Laocoon and his sons, really in the 1st century AD, and what a complete difference of freedom of form, the softness, the expression of the faces, the depiction of movement and form, totally different. This is a preview, if you will, of what you'll see in Michelangelo some more than 1,000 years later. Fantastic art in the classic Hellenistic period that is part of what we think of as the extraordinary skill, grace, and beauty of the Greek culture. It's why we admire it so much. Well, here we see other types of art, these urns and vases. This is a depiction of the suicide of Ajax. It's an episode from the Trojan War. The Aeneid tells the story of the Trojan War and provides examples of the medical treatments of the war victims. The Trojan War is also described by Homer, of course, but the Aeneid is the one where we learn a great deal about their medical facilities, or medical treatments. It was believed and described in the Iliad and the Odyssey that Apollo is the one who caused the plague, a god. The description of treatments of wounds, the use of opium, physicians were named, and then incantations and other sorts of charms were used in order to try to heal. So the Iliad described the plague caused by Apollo that stopped when Apollo had been placated. The wound descriptions are removing foreign bodies, washing, applying drugs that had magical powers, and so forth. So here you see a quote from the Iliad. Cut this arrow out of my leg, wash the blood from it with warm water, put the right things on it, the plants they say you've learned about from Achilles, who learned them from Chiron, the best of the centaurs. And you see on the amphora, the vase on the right, again, figures from these battle motifs. So in Sophocles' tragedy, Philoctetes is bitten by a snake. You see here an image of it, and the wounds are treated with herbs, and he's cured by military doctors that happen to be at Troy. Well, we know of the mathematical beginnings. Essentially all of Western mathematics comes from the foundations of the Greeks, and Pythagoras was one of the most famous, whose various theorems were basically based around a philosophy for mathematics. And while he's best known for the Pythagorean theorem, of course, about the dimensions of a triangle, it's interesting to note that he was also an advocate of vegetarianism. Well, the Alcmaeon of Croton describes recognition of the brain as the seat of thought and feeling. If you remember, the Egyptians discarded the brains and didn't believe that that was the seat of the thought. They thought the heart was the place where thought and feeling occurred. And in terms of their ability to describe health as a balance between properties like heat and cold, moisture and dryness, bitterness and sweetness, was, I think, very much of an early notion of something quite sensible.